Well, greetings vinyl community and welcome to VC Friday. This week I'll be discussing 5 new additions to my collection, starting off with Stormbringer by John and Beverly Martin from 1970. That's John and Beverly Martin, Martin with a Y and Stormbringer with an exclamation point. You may be aware that Deep Purple made an album titled Stormbringer and they forgot the exclamation point. So their album just doesn't really make it like this one does. This one's got the exclamation point, so you know it's good. This is from 1970, and although John and Beverly Martin are certainly classic members of the British folk rock scene, this was recorded in America with some American musicians, several of whom had associations with Bob Dylan. There's Levon Helm playing drums on some tracks, Billy Mundy on others, Harvey Brooks is on bass, and the musical director and keyboard player is Paul Harris, but it's produced by Joe Boyd, who produced everybody in the British folk rock scene, so it's got that imprimatur as well. The married couple aspect of it, John and Beverly Martin, I think that irresistibly brings to mind Richard and Linda Thompson. This is maybe a little less eloquent than Richard and Linda Thompson, maybe a little less ephemeral or ethereal than Nick Drake, maybe a little less intense than Roy Harper, but it's in that neighborhood. So if you're a fan of any of those other artists, this is definitely in your wheelhouse. This is for you. This copy is a white label promo US copy on Warner Brothers. And the songs are, well, unlike Richard and Linda Thompson, Beverly Martin wrote her own songs. So these alternate. Each side has 5 songs, which is 3 John songs interspersed with 2 Beverly songs. And in fact, Beverly's song Sweet Honesty is kind of the standout track as far as one that I actually was aware of, had heard on radio back in the day. It must have been. And I thought that was so unlikely that I wondered if maybe it was somebody else who had covered that song and had some radio success with it, but I couldn't find that that was the case. So I think that it was actually a little bit of a push for this album from the song Sweet Honesty, which is kind of Beverly's signature song. She wrote an autobiography using that title. And John's certainly no slouch either, as I'd alluded to before. He did go on to be the solo artist, while Beverly kind of got stuck back in the shadows, raising children and such. And his song, Would You Believe Me, final song on the album, one of the deepest, most beautiful things ever. Fantastic song. So it's a really, really nice example of the British folk rock genre from 1970, Stormbringer, John and Beverly Martin.
A vision of sweet honesty, sweet honesty, sweet honesty, sweet honesty.
Turning to the world of jazz, we have Eddie Harris live at Newport from 1971, recorded the previous year at the Newport Jazz Festival. Eddie Harris is credited only with playing electric saxophone in the notes, but he also plays the unusual contraption you can see him playing in the top picture there, which is a trumpet that is fitted with a saxophone-type mouthpiece, so he calls that the reed trumpet, and actually does a little speech on here explaining why that instrument exists and how he created it. The other musicians are Jody Christian on piano and electric piano, Louis Spears on bass, who provides a couple of wonderful solos, and Bob Crowder on drums. The opening track, Children's Song, begins with distorted and echoing chanting, interspersed with percussive sounds that are actually produced by Eddie Harris drumming on the keys of the electric saxophone. So we've got this very unusual kind of tribal effect that goes on for quite a while before the standard jazz quartet enters. Carry On Brother is the second track, and that's a good solid funk arrangement. And the side concludes with Don't You Know the Future's in Space, which is a long piece that begins with a sort of breezy and swinging jazz waltz, but eventually goes off into the stratosphere because Eddie Harris is really exploring different sounds that he can produce with his electric instruments. He plays the reed trumpet on here. He plays the saxophone through the baritone sound system, which produces a kind of weird wah-wah on this solid, funky, bluesy jazz section at the end. Side one begins with a guest appearance by Eugene McDaniels. The song is titled Silent Majority, written by McDaniels. And of course, Eugene McDaniels was also the person who wrote Compared to What, which was famously recorded by Eddie Harris with Les McCann on this album, which is shown on the back, the Swiss Movement album. And Silent Majority begins with a kind of gospel opening and turns into a hard funk number that amusingly uses 2 and 4 verses 1 and 3 to symbolize black folks versus white folks. And if you know clapping, you'll know what that refers to. Next track is Walk Soft, which interestingly features an 11/4 beat, or 3 bars of 3/4 and a bar of 2/4, so you get real wrong-footed on that one. And after all the funk and electronic experimentation, South Side, the last track on the album, is another long one, again like with The Future's in Space, solos from everybody, but it's fast bop. So it shows that Eddie Harris can really play that kind of stuff. That's he's not just disappeared into the commercial realms of funk as it was kind of perceived at the time by the critics. And there's the original Atlantic Inner Sleeve from 1971. I've heard from people who like to use these Atlantic Inner Sleeves as book covers when they were in school. So after checking out at Vinyl Solution with the Eddie Harris album and one other that I'll show later, I found a couple of cool classical albums in the freebie bin by the door. And one of them is this recording of Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony from 1964, recorded in England by the Philharmonia Orchestra with Paul Kletsky conducting, and some cool Kandinsky art on the cover as well. Prokofiev wrote the Fifth Symphony in 1944. It's scored for a good-sized orchestra with lots of percussion and piano. It's in a fairly standard symphonic form with a sonata form first movement, and that basically just means that there are two contrasting themes that play against each other. And the second movement is a scherzo, which has a really cool, snappy theme, great tune. The third movement is very long and deep and kind of Mahler-like. And the final movement is a rondo, as symphonic finales often are, which means there's a basic theme that keeps recurring with episodes in between. And the recurring theme is another real snappy, jaunty tune that's a really good match for the snappy theme in the second movement. So it's got that coherence to it. Now, Prokofiev, in writing what the symphony was about, said that it was a hymn to free and happy man, to his mighty powers, his pure and noble spirit. And that's the kind of bullshit that a Soviet composer had to write because Stalin. Just writing abstract music for the sake of it is decadent and bourgeois, so you had to have a meaning to your music, and it had to preferably celebrate the spirit of communist man. But it was recorded under Stalin, and this is 1944, and Stalin was out there kicking Nazi ass. So this actually is relevant to the symphony, because when Prokofiev conducted the premiere in January 1944, he stepped up to the podium and had to pause because of artillery fire going on outside the hall. And what that was about was a celebration that the Russian army had just crossed over into Germany. Take that, Schicklgruber. Going back almost 100 years from the Prokofiev piece is the opera Marta by the 19th century German composer Friedrich von Flotow. He's really only remembered for this opera, written in 1847. And it's a comic opera about a noblewoman, Lady Harriet, and her sidekick Nancy. I like to think of them as Lucy and Ethel. But they have the harebrained scheme that they think it would be a lark to go to the hiring fair and pose as maidservants for hire. And they do so, and they get picked up by a couple of farmer brothers, and they try to laugh it off, but the sheriff tells them, no, you're now contracted. You have to go with these farmers. So, alas, Lady Harriet, who is posing as Martha, and Nancy is now Julia. I still think of them as Lucy and Ethel. They have to go to the farm with the brothers, who proceed to fall in love with them, but they escape. And without going through the whole rigmarole, they meet and unmeet and fall in love and fall in hate at various times, but never at the same time with each other. And along the way, Lionel sings a song in praise of beer. You've got to have a song in praise of beer. And it turns out that Lionel, who is not really Plunkett's brother, he's adopted, is actually a nobleman, so he can marry Lady Harriet at all, except that he hates her at this point. But it all ends happily with everybody getting married to everyone else and probably having some more of that beer. I told you that story to tell you this one. The big hit single from this opera is, well, this is in German. It takes place in England, but it's in German. And the big hit single is Ach so fromm, ach so traut, or Oh so pure, oh so dear. And that, for some reason, has been popularized in an Italian translation as Mapari. And one thing that attracts me to this is that that song or that aria is used it's a motif that recurs in the novel Ulysses by James Joyce, which I mentioned in my last video about Jefferson Airplane, my favorite book of all time. But Mapari, or Ach so fromm, ach so traut, was also used in a Popeye cartoon. That's where I first heard it. A Popeye cartoon from 1940 titled Shakespearean Spinach. And in this cartoon, Popeye and Olive Oyl and Bluto, for some reason, are all actors on Broadway at the Spinach Theater, and they're performing Romeo and Juliet. And Bluto comes to the theater expecting to play Romeo, except that he discovers that he's been replaced by Popeye. So he goes into the backstage area and starts sabotaging the production while Popeye is serenading Olive Oyl at the balcony using the theme from Marta, singing this song with new English lyrics, great lyrics that they came up with apparently just for the cartoon. I don't know if there was any old 78 record that may have used those English lyrics. I think it was probably written for the cartoon. At least I'd like to think so. And eventually, Bluto gets Popeye boxed up backstage and goes out himself in costume, and the song is still going through all this action. So he just picks up the reprise of the main melody and sings to Olive Oyl, like a beam from above, heavenly radiant Juliet appeared. This is Bluto singing to Olive Oyl, and Olive Oyl responds. This is the same words that Popeye had sung, but now Olive Oyl sings different words. She sings to Bluto, get out, scram, clumsy ham, you're a monkey with a beard. It's, I thought that was hilarious. So then, of course, there's a big fight between Popeye and Bluto. When Popeye comes out, he's now replaced Olive Oyl as Juliet. So Popeye's in drag while he's having a big knockdown, drag-out fight with Bluto. And while this is happening, the background music is a muted trumpet playing a jazz version of this song. Of course, until the spinach comes into play, and at which point we get the usual Popeye the Sailor Man music. But that is culture, and that's what cartoons can teach us.
Die Zukunft mir umhüllt, doch mit ihr blühte mir neues Dasein Lust erfüllt. Wie es schwand, was ich fand, ach mein Glück erschaut ich kam, bin erwacht und die Nacht raubte mir.
Finally, I picked up this recording of the Threepenny Opera, or Die Dreigroschenoper, by Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht. This is from 1928 and based loosely on John Gay's The Beggar's Opera from exactly 200 years earlier, in 1728, and also incorporating ballads by François Villon from the 15th century. But it's a very modern work with a very modern feel and a decadent feel and popularized feel, because the score includes folk instruments like banjo and slide guitar and bandoneon, which is like an accordion. as well as, you've got like 21, 23 instruments at least that have to be played by 7 people. So everybody gets to sort of run around picking up a mandolin here and putting down a cello there, or trading a saxophone for a clarinet. But this is the opera, although it's more like a musical theater piece as we would understand it today, because it's not all singing. It's the complete score as it's advertised, that's misleading, because this is just the music. There's a lot of dialogue, so you don't get the complete story here. This is like a Broadway musical where they do spoken dialogue in between. You get a sheet with the translations of all the sung numbers, but not the German original. This is sung in German by members of the Vienna State Opera Company with F. Charles Adler as the conductor. And one of the singers who plays Polly is just credited as Leanne, just one name like Cher or Madonna, because apparently she was a bit of a pop star in Europe in the 50s. And her full name was Leanne Augustine. Now, the Threepenny Opera gave us, of course, Mac the Knife, and Pirate Jenny as well, that was sung by Steeleye Span. They retitled it The Black Freighter. It was sung by Judy Collins, and I think Nina Simone did a version. And Mac the Knife is the opening track. It's actually Mackie Messer is how he's addressed in German, and his real name is Macheath. So Macheath is the guy who's real handy with a knife. He's a murderer. He's not just a murderer, he's also an arsonist, and a rapist, and a pimp, and a wife beater. So he's the hero of the opera. The bad guy in the opera is Peachum. He's like Fagin in Oliver Twist, because he's the boss of the beggars. He's the guy who assigns them their territory, tells them where they can sit, and trains them on how to beg effectively, and then he claims a percentage of their take. He wants Macheath out of the way, so he is blocked by the chief of police, who is old army buddies with Macheath. But finally, he manages to get Macheath condemned to death. And at the very last minute, just before Macheath is about to be hanged, a courier comes riding in with a message from the Queen that Macheath has been pardoned and granted a lavish pension and a castle, and he's made a nobleman. So that's the happy ending of the Threepenny Opera. And aren't you glad you don't live in a country where the absolute worst people can be rewarded with wealth and high position?
Und der Haifisch, der hat Zähne und die Träger im Gesicht. Und Macheath, der hat ein Messer, doch das Messer sieht man nicht. Joan war darunter und Jim war dabei und Georgie ist Sergeant geworden. Doch die Armee, sie fliegt keiner mehr es sei und marschierte hinauf nach dem Norden. Soldaten wohnen auf den Kanonen, vom Kopf bis auf der Hand. Wenn es da regnete und es begegnete ihnen eine neue Rasse, die braune oder blasse, dann machen sie vielleicht daraus ihr Besteck apart.
And that's Vinyl Friday. Thanks very much for watching. Be well. I will talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.
honey. Yes. The President of the United States is named Schicklgruber.